In this video, I tell you how granola bars, sort of, can help you cover up the holes in your Slotta bases. So here's something that I came up with pretty recently. It was kind of those, what do you call it? Necessity is the mother of invention sort of situations. I was downstairs in the nerd bunker and I was looking to put a model on a circular base. Now there are different types of circular bases out there, but we're all kind of familiar with the normal black plastic, 25 millimeter kind of angled side base. And of those bases, there are mainly two kinds. There's the nice solid kind that has no hole in it or anything. These, in my opinion, are lovely. You can kind of see here, you got yourself like a weird little nub in there, but that's basically about it. You've got pretty much that. These are great, and if you can find these, always use them, in my opinion. That's just my personal preference. But there's another kind of base as well that's known as a Slotta base. And they're older, I think, mainly, and it's for back when models were mainly metal. This is an old scary chaos guy here, and you'll notice that if I peel away, he's got this weird tab between his feet, and they're designed to go into this slot in the Slotta base, hence the name Slotta base. I don't know if that's a technical term or not, but that's kind of what they are. So it's this Slotta base, and you're supposed to glue them in there, but then you always have this sort of gap, and there's a lot of weird stuff. And so I was trying to basically use one of these types of bases on a model that didn't have the little slot piece along the bottom. It was a plastic model. So I'm like, I need to cover up this weird little hole in my model or in my base. I need to cover it up so stuff doesn't go down inside there, and it just makes it easier to do all the stuff that you need to go, doing forward. Now, while I was doing this, I remember it, I was eating a granola bar. I like granola bars, and I eat them quite frequently. So I was thinking about well, what kind of material that I have down here in the nerd bunker could I use to cover over this hole in the Slotta base? It doesn't have to be a super strong thing, because I'm just gonna put texture over it with some CA glue afterwards, which that'll become another video down the road. But I need something to go over this, and I'm not quite sure what. So I chewed on my granola bar and I thought about it. It's got peanut butter. So anyway, I'm looking around on my table, which is always just a hot mess. I really need to organize a little bit better and all that stuff. But I'm looking at my table and I'm like, well, there's a thin piece of blister pack plastic that I could cut to size, and then I could glue it over the Slotta base hole. Well, that might work, but it's going to give a bit of a bump, because even though it's very thin plastic, it's not that thin. And I thought, well, what else do I have? I could go find a piece of tape, maybe. I don't know. There's got to be something that I could use to cover up these tiny little holes. I just use some super glue, glue it down, cover it up. Something really super flat, something really thin. Now, if you're slightly smarter than I am, you will have probably determined that at some point I figured, this very thin polyfilm that keeps my lovely, granola bars fresh and keeps the weevils off of them, that might work pretty well. And you'd be right. It actually works pretty much super well for trying to cover up the little holes in these Slotta bases. So this is what you do. You take your granola bar. Well, you don't take the granola bar. You actually just take the plastic bit, and you use some tiny scissors, or you use an X-Acto. You try not to cut off your thumb, or because you need your thumb a lot. You can cut off your pinky. No, I wouldn't cut off any of your fingers if you can get around it. And then you just basically take it and you figure out what size it needs to be here on the Slotta base. You just cut along and you trim it down. That's pretty much it. You trim that down, and then you use some glue and you glue it down. You use some sort of CA glue, super glue, cyanoacrylate is what CA glue is, and you glue down the little patch that you've made out of the plastic, the very thin polyfilm that's been protecting your granola bar or candy bars. Other things come in polyfilm, but those are the thinnest that I can think of. So candy bars, if you're into that, or granola bars, if you're like me, whatever, use some sort of plastic like that, and then glue it down over the hole. All right, I've trimmed this down So now it fits over the hole here. And a lot of people will tell you, yeah, but you should just use like green putty or liquid green, not liquid green stuff, regular green stuff, you know, where there's a lot of different things you could use to fill in those holes. And yeah, that's true, but it's kind of a pain in the ass, frankly. Like this is really simple. You just cut the hole, you know, cut that piece of foil so that it goes over the hole. And then that's pretty much all you've got to do. Then you take a little bit of glue. See if I can get this out of the shadow here. And you just put it along the edges. Just get it on there. That's all you got to do. And then you take your piece of foil, polyfilm, you stick it over there. You position it a little bit with your... This is hard to do on camera. It's actually easy to do if you're not trying to film it. And you just sort of position it with the blade. That's all you got to do. Now we got it right on there. It's covering the hole. Now, someone's going to say in the comments, I'm sure, they're going to be like, yeah, but what happens if you poke a hole through the film at some point down the road with your miniatures? You know, your base, you might poke a hole. And my question at that point is like, why are you poking holes in your bases? Nothing sharp should be trying to point or poke at your models. You know, once they've been painted and finished and all that stuff, you should keep them in those little foam things or do something, but don't just throw them in a shoebox. If you throw a bunch of them in a shoebox, somebody's combat knife very possibly may poke through the base in a, you know, amazing, perfect world. Well, imperfect world, really. But don't worry about that. Really, what you're going to do is you've here now built yourself a nice little base. You've got a little base that now needs to have super glue covered it, and then sand, and kitty litter, baking soda, whatever you want to talk about. Like I said, I'm going to talk about that in another video. But that's it. It's very quick and simple. If you've got any edges that stick off a little bit, you can just trim them off with your X-Acto. Like if this is like, well, that's bothering me a little bit, I can just trim it. Just shave it off and you're fine. You've got yourself a nice thing. And once you cover it up, it's going to become solid as a rock. These are some that I did earlier. You can see the blue. I don't remember what the heck I was eating, but it has like a blue. Like these guys actually have the tab in between their feet. I didn't even bother to cut it off. So I stuck them into the Slotta base, but then there was still all this extra space. So I just cut a very thin little slice of polyfilm from my granola bar and slid it in between there, a little bit of glue. And when I covered it, when I prime these guys, they're gonna look great because you're not gonna even notice that this was on a Slotta base, even though it certainly was. Those Slotta bases, a lot of people are annoyed by them, but I don't think you should throw them out. You shouldn't get rid of them. It's very simple to use materials that you've got around the house to basically take those products and still use them. They're not necessarily the way that we see stuff these days. Most bases now are generally not slotted because people don't bother, usually in a lot of models these days, to put that metal in between like that. That little tab that you have to, and in my situation, I almost always clip off and then I end up pinning it to the bottom. So think about things like this. Just sitting here and munching on a granola bar and thinking about, you know, this plastic probably would work just great for something like that. You've got lots and lots of little opportunities like that in your hobby life to go, you know, I could repurpose that. And then it's gonna become something else. And I'm gonna feel pretty smart about it. So think about this, maybe look at some other things you've got around and, you know, cover up your Slotta bases.